Welcome to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Madden. I've had an amazing 35 years in the elevator industry, and now I'm ready to pay my knowledge forward. Let's dive right in. Welcome to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm very excited to be here with John Koshak. He's got a lot of industry knowledge and experience. John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got in the industry, and what your journey was to get here today?
Thank you, Sean. Briefly started in the elevator industry in 1980 and just walked in the door of Westinghouse, and they hired me the next Monday. First question that I was asked was, who's your brother, who's your cousin, who's your daddy, who's your mama? And I wasn't related to anybody in the industry, so that was a learning experience from the start. Everybody suspected I was somebody's brother-in-law. And, you have to earn your chops in the business. I started in construction for Westinghouse doing hydros and did hydros as a helper for probably a year and a half. And then they put me with an adjuster because I had been an electrician, and they recognized early that I knew electricity, I could wire, I could do pull sheets and not fumble them. And the time with the adjusters were incredibly good from a career standpoint. I would take prints home, for example, and map all the relays, identify what they did and all the switches, and I'd come back and ask pertinent questions, and the adjusters were impressed. And it's like, wow, this kid, he wants to learn. And I think if you have that kind of incentive and you want to do it, the adjusters take that to heart, and they provide all the help I ever asked for. Eventually, they made me a TM, which was another boon after a year and a half, and I was putting hydros in and actually started adjusting hydros at year 2.5.
Wow.
And in year 1, I finished the NEEP modules for probationary helpers, now called apprentices. And the NEEP coordinator said, hey, we need instructors, and you seem like you could do it. So I became a NEEP instructor, and I did that for 9 years. Eventually got my mechanics card in 1984, stayed with Westinghouse, adjusting, and then one day the boss said, hey, we want you to do earthquake as a temporary mechanic, and I was just excited to be a TM.
Yeah.
And he said, go talk to this guy and ask anything you need to ask. And I said, well, thank you very much. I won't let you down. And I went to see Al Boma, the superintendent, and he said, do you have any questions? And I said, yeah, what's earthquake? I had no idea what it was. For those in non-seismic zones, earthquake wiring requires taking a box, and in the event you detect an earthquake of Richter scale 4 or greater, you have to stop the elevator from moving and bring it to a floor and open the doors and essentially kill the elevator. So Westinghouse had all the equipment of the day, RSBLs, RELs, ERLs, hydros, DMRs. I was able and given the opportunity to see every elevator system in San Francisco in Local 8. And I would travel around. Local 8 is a very large local. It's kind of unique. It goes from Oregon border to Bakersfield, from the ocean to Elko, Nevada. I was doing earthquake all around Local 8.
Wow.
And eventually, like every young temporary mechanic, I wanted to buy a house. I started taking calls, and you learn a lot on callbacks. Great learning experience, allowed me to go forth with life and buy a house. Eventually, I left Westinghouse in 85, I think, went to Dover and learned how to adjust Dover composites. And I adjusted 500-600 of them.
Wow.
And in the years I was with Dover, and became a superintendent, actually, at Dover for a year and a half. I did a year at Montgomery, adjusting Dovers, had a half a route, left them, went back to Dover, and left them again, and ultimately went to Amtech, where I spent the last probably 8 years in the field. And it was during my time at Amtech that I invented the life jacket and installed one at one of my jobs, actually, the Oakland City Hall. And people came and looked at it and said, wow, this is really cool. And Adams eventually said, hey, we'll take it on as a product. And I left the field in 1998 and became VP of tech support at Adams. 5 years with Adams, and started consulting with a consultant named Dick Gregory.
Mm-hmm.
Dick was my predecessor at Adams. I had taken his place. And as soon as I started doing independent consulting with Dick's company, Vertex, I got a call from Thyssen, and the CEO offered me a job, and John Brandt called again and said, I'd like you to be the director of codes. And I said, okay, and moved me to Memphis in 2006. And then the CEOs changed. So I pulled out the shingle and I threw out my consulting business and started going with Dick Gregory again. Probably worked with Dick as an independent consultant for a year and a half until Dick said, you're ready, you're on your own, and I've been consulting ever since. I'm still on the standards committee and I still am on working committees. When you know the nuts and bolts, when you can put the erector set together, and when you've maintained them and adjusted them, and then you go to a manufacturing company like Adams, you learn manufacturing, pricing, and then you get on the litigation side. Companies have obligations to maintain the equipment. And so today, probably 50% of my business, about 10 years into the litigation side, one of the major problems, I think, in the industry is lack of maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
And the maintenance control program in Section 8.6 was drafted in 2000 and has had some revisions through the years. But at the end of the day, the MCPs that I saw in doing casework don't comply with the code, in my opinion. And I would question them in my reports, and I would be told, you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that resulted in me finally saying, hey, here's how I would do it. And I called the company EMCP and began selling the product.
I've seen your EMCP and used it myself, and it's pretty impressive. It's got all the nuts and bolts and all the pieces, and I'm very impressed by that. And you're right. When I started Madden Elevator, it was just me. So the first thing I did is went out and did really good service, and I hardly had any callbacks, just with basic PM. And I proved what I always thought was true. But doing good service and cleaning your elevators and following a good program like EMCP definitely saves on callbacks, wear and tear, and liability as well. You have a very diverse background. I've known a lot of bits and pieces of this over the years, but I'd never heard it from the start. And I did not know that you started in the industry by walking in a door. That's not very common in our industry, especially in the 80s. So that's pretty intriguing to find out. And hearing your journey, which really lends to why you do what you do today with your professional work in the 2 or 3 different businesses you're working in. So this is really about the elevator entrepreneurs, see different things, hear different backgrounds and perspectives. So what is something that you've seen in our industry or challenges you might see specific elevator entrepreneurs facing? Is there something specific that comes to mind for you?
Yeah, many things. I think the industry and labor are certainly places for improvement. And in the labor side, aside from the shortage, I think that whether you're a union or merit shop, we'll take apprentices and we'll put them through, a 4 or 5 year course and teach them, okay, here are the parts, the nuts and the bolts, the platform, the style, what's an interlock. But then you get into the side of the business where now you're a mechanic and you've been trained on the general parts and pieces. And generally, it's going to be just generic education. If you advance in your career, you ultimately may get into maintenance. Some people don't want to get into maintenance. They're constructors, they want to stay there. But if you're getting into maintenance, suddenly now you're given a route. A route has, depending on the company, 80 to 350 units, and that's a problem in itself. You've got a whole diverse constellation of different units, manufacturers, ages, technologies that make the elevator go up and down. So one of the things that I find is that foreign equipment for a major company would be equipment that's not of their manufacturer. So Otis might have Thyssen or Westinghouse equipment.
Yeah.
I'll give an example. Trip and fall on a Dover composite,
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm very familiar with. And by the descriptions, the callback tickets that were provided, clearly it was a trip and fall and the car was misleveling at the landing. When asked about what the mechanic did or didn't do or what he knew or didn't know, we asked him what compounding was, and he said, yeah, I maintain the brushes, I pull on the pigtail, and they should be free, and I snap them. And he said, sometimes they don't snap, they're not free. And so I take WD-40 and I spray it to free it up. So here's a 26, 27-year-old elevator mechanic who's given on his route equipment that clearly he wasn't trained for. The generic training of apprenticeship, NEEP, or CET training is inadequate on every periodic test. Every maintenance mechanic should be able to do every Category 1 test.
Yep. I agree 100%.
Period. If you don't know how to do that, you really shouldn't be maintaining it.
Well, going back to the generator just for a moment, it was intriguing to me because I came originally, when I started working on elevators and started adjusting elevators, I was mostly in hydros. So I didn't have a lot of traction training. And then I relocated and came to Irvin Elevator. I think you know the late Roger Irvin. And Roger taught me the Ward Leonard circuits and the generator systems and how they worked and compounding and all that. And then I ended up teaching people in the future. But it's interesting because it's a dying art and there are not as many of them around. So companies don't look for that kind of training. They really go more towards the new modern boards type training. And you can get vendors to come in and do that a lot easier than you can just, a lot of times, even the supervisors and top tier troubleshooters don't even fully understand compounding anymore, which I find very disturbing, really, because that's the first thing I always ask people when they say there's leveling problems. Have you magged the generator? And a lot of people didn't even know how to mag a generator. It was like, wow. So that dying art is a problem without any training. And these techs and companies really have to find the information and learn more about it. And luckily, some techs that are out there will ask questions and try to find training. There was something up in New York they tried for a little bit, and some people would go to that specific site training that's about different types of equipment. But it is definitely a big challenge in our industry for sure.
One thing about Amtech, and we're going now back to the late 80s, Amtech would hire a Dover guy, a Westinghouse guy, Otis guy, a Montgomery guy, and then at least once a month, if not more, they would have us, the specialist of a particular brand, teach a class. They'd buy pizza for the whole crew. We'd open up the shop, put a big blackboard up, and somebody would talk about a particular design to all the other mechanics. That was their modus operandi. And I thought, what a brilliant way to go about it.
Yeah. That is a great idea, really. I guess a lot of times people have a hard time affording something like that. But as you grow, you definitely have to find a way to get those specialized trainings on all those different types of equipment.
Amtech didn't pay us to go to those classes. They didn't pay us to teach the classes. This was Wednesday nights, 6 o'clock. Show up if you want to learn. And if you didn't want to learn, of course, I guess an internal black mark in the company. So to me, that was how the knowledge was passed. And I don't see that much anymore.
Yeah. It's a dying art, too, for getting people to actually come in after hours on their own time to learn. They want to get paid for it. So that's a challenge, too, in the different generations and different technologies.
Well, there's just too much information for a guy to pick it up reading a book or watching a YouTube. Going back to 1980, and I'm taking prints home and I'm diagramming all the relays and the switches to understand. I think every new mechanic should have that kind of incentive to improve their career. And if it's not inherent, I don't know that I would hire a guy.
Right.
If somebody said to me, well, I'm not coming in unless you pay me.
Yeah.
I'm not taking these prints home unless somebody paid. Maybe the world has changed. I still meet mechanics, and there are those that want that, and they're willing to give their time to make themselves better. There's a corollary to the young person not knowing old stuff, 20, 30-year, 40-year mechanics, who all they know is the old stuff, and that's the stuff they want to keep and they know they're comfortable with. And then starting in the late 90s, they started throwing computer controllers. And one of the things that I didn't mention, I was a computer nerd. Me and another elevator guy, Joe Garner, had a bulletin board system back when CompuServe was the thing. We put together a class on how to do I/O, and everybody had to pay $200 to buy the parts, but we went, bought all the parts, built it, and we taught them the language called BASIC, taught them how to assemble the language, and to pass the class, they had to have a duplex elevator on the screen, and it had to be 5-stop, and the doors had to open and close.
That's cool.
So, yeah, when computer elevators came out, it was old hat. Okay, you got to tell something to do something with logic. In the old days, we used relays. Now we're using software. So getting that concept to older mechanics without any supplementary training, it's got to be mind-numbing. And so older mechanics, they tend not to want to touch it or do anything with it, and they just want to be a board changer.
Yeah.
But even worse is the younger mechanics are just being taught to board change, and they're not learning I/O. So we're not troubleshooting realistically. Door strike incidents and other incidents are, I think, being caused by serial communication delays. Technology is wonderful when it works, but if there's a communication delay between you break the beam on the door reopening device and 600 milliseconds go by, the door is going to close 600 milliseconds because it's going to do the last thing it was told to do, which was go full speed. And so signal processing can be a problem in the serial communication. Technology has to work, and it has to work like it used to. And
you mentioned the boards and stuff. I remember many times people trying to do what we called swaptronics. It was don't know what's wrong with it, just to start changing boards out. And that was the worst thing. It drove me nuts. Like, I want to troubleshoot to the problem and understand exactly what's going on before I start changing anything, because now you just introduce new problems. And so oftentimes, because I was a troubleshooter, so I would go in and they'd change all the DMC boards out. And it's like, oh my God, what do we got? Or even Dover 4 slots, or, any kind of boards. It's like, what are you doing? That was one of the things that we try to teach people is don't change anything until you 100% know what it is, and then change one thing at a time and make sure nothing else changes so that you're not introducing different challenges. So troubleshooting in general is a process to teach people, but then, like you said earlier, the specifics of the different types of equipment, they need to understand the challenges. And specifically, especially with generators, I get worried to death with generators and leveling issues, because I dealt with that for years and years. Even when I was at previous companies of my own elevator company, that I was always the safety guy. Anybody got hurt, I had to collect all the data. I had to work through all the details, understand what's going on, get the inspector involved. And it always led to, you could see it, like you could see the problem starting. I'm telling them myself, even though I was a supervisor, I couldn't keep up with every single thing that went on. But when something happened and you go back and look at the data, you're like, oh, yeah, it's right here. I see it starting. What's an idea that you might have to improve on this training? Like, how could elevator entrepreneurs, or any independent elevator company for that matter, improve on a training program?
Yeah, it's a struggle because the resources aren't readily available. Companies going to be limited to the resources they have on hand. But even if it's just using your one or two, or if you have more adjusters, having informal training and investing in teaching younger mechanics old systems, so you get the old guy to say, well, in my day, this is how we did it, and 123 Main Street has this kind of equipment, and just walk through common problems. Then the younger mechanics teaching the older mechanics the computer. I think if you simplify IO, we just place the logic in a different place. Everybody
Right.
can understand, most people can understand relay logic. And all software does is replace the relay logic with software logic.
Yeah.
And getting a signal into it and out of the computer, that's probably 50% of all the problems in the computer elevator world. One of the hazards, and you see this with mechanics and helpers who have been injured on the job, they grew up with a Galaxy or a Swift or a Smart Rise controller that has a lot of modern redundancy and safety features so that if something shorts, it won't allow an unsafe condition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those things don't exist in the old world. And we really need to stress to young people that older equipment doesn't have these built-in safety redundancies. So teaching a kid about suicide circuits and just mentioning it when I do code classes, mentioning a suicide circuit, having somebody say to me, what is that, is scary.
Yeah, that's concerning, right?
It's called suicide circuit for a reason. It should get your attention.
I still hear stories. Even I'd say 5 years ago, we had a scenario where we picked up a job that was installed from, I don't know, we'll call it the 2000s. It was over 10 years old. And the pit stop switch was jumped out from the factory. How many annual safety tests have been done and 5 year safety tests and people getting in and out of the pit? And nobody's ever checked the pit stop switch appropriately or effectively.
Yeah.
So it's just those little things are just huge. Training is very important. I liked your idea of the after hour training. We did a lot of that at my company, Madden Elevator. We would pay them 30 minutes to drive to the office at the end of their day. So they all got 30 minutes and they got fed that night. And we would have an hour to 2 hour training, depending on how deep or how much chit chat was at the end. And that really seemed to help people tremendously. So I think that's a great idea. And educating people not only on different specific types of equipment, but also just safety training, I think, is one of the biggest things. We had a weekly safety training, and I always tried to relate it to a story or a situation. That was one of the stories I told all the time about the pit stop switch. And you probably have a ton of stories because I think safety is extremely important. And a lot of times, safety, it's the small things. Like I had another story where a tech was opening up a Northern TC 181 and he popped the door before the car got away from the floor, and it was a door key with the bar that went through it. Well, it grabbed his hand and slammed his hand against the door jamb with the door key and put a hole in his hand. I told that story all the time because I wanted the new techs to understand it. And somebody told me one time, I'm so glad you told me this because every time I go to put a door key in, I think about that story. But that's the power of those. And the same thing with training, those old guys that have that experience with suicide circuits and making sure you're making motors and generators out effectively and properly. But I think that's a good idea that you had about getting the owners of these companies and the leaders of these companies need to find someone to come in after hours and train the young people on the specifics of the equipment these people need to know the basics of and make sure they understand how to be safe around them.
Yeah.
Any last comments you want to add, John?
If there are any mechanics watching and any superintendents, if you want to add something to safety training, make sure all your gibs are at the proper depth.
Yeah, that's a good one. And oftentimes, they bend down the quote unquote fire tabs, which really isn't a fire retainer. If there's actually a fire retainer on there, then there's a little bit of extra safety, but the fire tabs that's on the gibs, they're not even in the sill. So if the gib was to fall off or become loose, oftentimes the retainers aren't even going to do anything. So That's a very important one too, because that's not only the techs that are dealing with that danger, but the riding public.
Yes.
Well, I sure appreciate your insights and ideas. I mean, we could be on here all day, I'm sure, John.
Yeah, we
But
could.
so many great things. I appreciate your time and appreciate you being on here, and appreciate the time that you spend helping educate elevator entrepreneurs. And like you said, any mechanics, supervisors, anybody.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm honored. I just think I'm a regular guy, and this is a unique thing you're doing. Appreciate what you're doing.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, John. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to the Elevator Entrepreneur Podcast. Until next time, stay safe out there, and I will continue to empower my fellow elevator entrepreneurs.